Welcome to RebellionZ, where we amplify the voices of today that will change tomorrow. In 2025, America's next president will inherit a world in turmoil. For young Americans, this past year has been a turning point. They've driven activism across cities and college campuses, openly questioning America's unwavering support for Israel. Today, we're bringing together a diverse group of young voices to discuss the challenges ahead and their views on the candidates vying to lead America on the world stage.
My name is JP Velsmil. I'm 23 years old. I'm a conservative Republican. Therefore, I'm definitely going to vote for Donald J. Trump.
My name is Saad Shuaib. I am 23 years old. I am from Jackson Heights, a neighborhood in Queens in New York City. I am personally conservative, but legislatively progressive, and I am undecided for this election.
I'm Ashley Bulus. I am 28 years old. I'm from Dearborn, Michigan. I am typically very left-leaning, and I am planning to vote Harris this election.
My name is Jacob Campbell. I'm 20 years old. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. I tend to lean to the right a little bit. I'm more of a moderate, and I haven't made up my mind as to who I'm going to be voting for.
Thanks, guys, for joining us for this conversation about foreign policy and the elections. I want to start out by asking you, you all grew up in a world shaped by the aftermath of 9/11 and the fallout from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You also grew up on the internet. How do you think that's impacted the way you view the world?
Yeah, I was talking about this with a friend recently. Growing up after 9/11 made our generation so aware of military issues specifically. We have that Middle East trauma, let's say. So I think my generation is conservatives as well, as opposed to the neocons of the past. We look at foreign conflict and we say hey guys, maybe we should show a little restraint here. I don't know if this is good for them or good for us. And I think that on the 9/11 question, that's definitely a factor.
Mm-hmm. Does that track with what you feel, Jacob?
Yeah, I think that just having internet as an availability, it makes accessing information a lot easier. People have the opportunity to gain information or knowledge at their fingertips that they at one point they didn't have. As to what JP was saying with the Middle East, I do think that 9/11 did shape the perceptions of a lot of people, particularly the young generation who saw what occurred on 9/11, and that it's caused some negative connotations and views towards the Middle East.
I want to pick up on something you said, Middle East trauma. What exactly is that?
Yeah, when I said it, I'm that doesn't sound very specific, but what I mean is the invasion of Iraq. I think that whenever someone thinks of the Middle East in the US, they think of the invasion of Iraq. That's the primary image that comes to mind to people in my generation. And now every politician is oh, it was a mistake. We wouldn't have done it. But if you go back in time, everyone was saying, let's invade Iraq. Mm-hmm. So I think that has created a sense of strategic humility in some portions of our establishment, some portions. But in our generation, it definitely has impacted the way we look at American intervention, at least in that region.
Yeah. Would you agree, Ashley?
I would agree to a certain point. So you had mentioned how there is a certain spread of information, obviously, with the internet and the accessibility of information. There's also an accessibility of misinformation and disinformation online. And when we look at things specifically like 9/11, like you mentioned, Middle East trauma, there is a lot of misinformation that kind of stows the flames of this hate towards Middle Eastern people, Arabs, Muslims. And it's something that we're seeing is very, very prevalent even again today with everything that's currently going on in the Middle East with Israel, Gaza, Lebanon. So that misinformation really does shape not only the way that our people view the Middle East, but the way that our government does and the way that our intervention is handled. So there is a certain way that misinformation really causes a detriment to us as an American people, not just to the Middle East.
Well, let's pick up on what is going on right now. Your generation's view on Israel's war on Gaza is starkly different than older generations. Polls show that only 15% of Gen Z is more sympathetic to Israel compared to 40% of baby boomers. So I want to ask you all, what do you think has led to this shift in perspective among your generation? Saad?
So, I think it's very important to point out that there is some would say culture shift. I would personally categorize it as a culture war that is going on in the West right now. And Israel as a nation state is losing that war. And they are losing that war not because they are Jewish, not because it is a Jewish state. They are losing that war because they are killing innocent people by the thousands, and potentially by the hundreds of thousands by the time that this genocide is over. And young people that have a moral compass are not okay with that.
Is it consistent with what you think as a conservative, JP?
Yeah, I definitely observe it. You know, some conservatives will be too quick and say like, oh, it's like the TikToks. I don't think it's just the TikToks, although, yeah, access to information plays a role. But it's true that my generation, number one, is less religious than generations before ours. So a lot of the attachments some people have with the state of Israel in the United States originates from a religious attachment in which they posit that the Israel in the Bible, the Jewish people in the Bible are the Jewish people in the Israel that are a state and the people living there.
Yeah, that explains the evangelical Christian support for Israel, which is less prevalent in your generation.
Yes, yeah. So no, it's still prevalent, but to less of a degree. You know, there's not many of them.
I want to get Ashley in here to weigh in on this, because I know that you've created content that is pro-Palestinian, and that's a very important issue to you.
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Now, I think one of the biggest factors of why our generation is much more pro-Palestinian than previous generations, first is the visibility factor. We have, like we talked about before, much more access to this information than we did in the past. But we are also a much less nationalistic generation than our predecessors were. We don't have this same unwavering support for our government, for our political systems. We are much more able to be critical of the policies that our politicians put forth, particularly as it pertains to our relationship with Israel. Whereas in the past, that was kind of an unquestionable relationship. To support U.S. was to support Israel. And we are more empathetic to the Palestinian struggle, to the struggle of the people in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen as a whole, because we don't have this innate drive to support every single thing that the country, the U.S. is doing. And part of that, I think, is from growing up in the post-9/11 generation, that we saw the impact of what our country did to other people overseas, and we just cannot support that any longer.
But is anyone here optimistic that this shift in public opinion, especially among younger folks, is actually going to translate into any meaningful change in terms of foreign policy, especially when we look at who the two candidates are? I see you shaking your head, Jacob. No.
No, it won't. The United States will always stand by Israel, as it should. I think that you can be critical of Israel's approach. I'm not very fond of Netanyahu as a very far right-leaning prime minister. You could criticize some of their military action. I think that there's argument on the table that they have committed war crimes. I think they do a good job of charging their soldiers and holding them accountable when they do things. There are a couple of issues and things that have come out where I think there needs to be more investigation and independent instead of the IDF investigating themselves. But in the general sense of things, I think that my generation seems to favor the Palestinian side because educationally, my generation has been taught to view things through an oppressor versus oppressed lens, and the weaker side is always the side that is better.
Well, let me follow up, Jacob, because I want to ask you, as a young American, do you feel like you benefit from your government's unconditional support for Israel?
I think that the United States benefits through an alliance with Israel, and that we receive a lot of information technologically. We help in the technological sector with Israel, as well as threats. Through threats of terrorism and things like that. And I think that a main tenet of the United States, or core value, is to spread Western influence, to spread Western ideals and values throughout the world. And I think Israel is the best example of that in the Middle East.
I want JP to have a word.
I want to jump in. I want to desperately jump in. I think many valid points have been made. I tend to agree with Jacob that Israel is a traditional ally, well, one of the most powerful military powers in the region, most innovative countries in the world. So it's good to have them around, at least traditionally speaking. At the same time, I do worry that a broader regional conflict might bring the U.S. into the conflict, which is where I say America first.
And what does that mean, America first?
America first. I'm not Muslim. I'm not Palestinian. I'm not Israeli. I'm not Jewish, like many Americans. I'm not deeply tied to that issue. And of course, I care about people not dying. Of course, I want everything to be the best possible for people in the world. At the same time, when I see what's happening here, I worry about the U.S. getting involved in this conflict a little too much. I wanted to add, we were talking about like what my generation thinks about foreign policy. They don't take foreign policy that seriously. They don't care that much. So they just see something happening somewhere else. They hear a 1-minute clip and then they react. So I wanted to add that as much as I think that my generation is gonna have an impact in the conversation in the future, I wouldn't overestimate it too.
Okay, you've heard a lot, Ashley. What do you want to add?
So to your point, there are probably quite a few Americans who do not care about foreign policy. In my community specifically, which is filled with Lebanese Americans, this is a very important issue to us, and it very much hits home for us. From my town specifically, there are approximately 143 Americans who are trapped in Lebanon right now, who do not have a plan for evacuation because the U.S. is not interfering in that way. They're not evacuating U.S. civilians, Lebanese civilians, my people, from our home that is being attacked. So it is a very important issue to a lot of Americans. It is a very big deal.
Yeah.
So we're obviously having this conversation about the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel ahead of an election. And I want to talk about where each of the candidates stand when it comes to Israel and if there's even a difference there. Former President Donald Trump called himself Israel's protector. Vice President Kamala Harris has repeatedly said that Israel has a right to defend itself. And at the Democratic National Convention this past summer, she said this.
President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
And here's what Trump says will happen if the Democrats win.
If Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are elected, the radical left flag burners and Hamas sympathizers will not just be causing chaos on our streets, they'll be running U.S. foreign policy in the White House, and Israel will be gone. It will be gone. I never thought I'd say that a year ago, even 2 years ago. I never thought I'd say it. But Israel will be gone, I believe.
I want to ask you guys who you believe, and I want to start with you, JP.
Who do I believe? I think they're politicians, and although Trump is the most honest of them all, they're politicians nonetheless. So they'll never say the truth entirely because they want to win an election. And losers don't legislate. I think that in this country, reality is that politically speaking, siding with Israel is still the way to go. That's why we see Kamala Harris saying what she says, although in the past, she was seen as a more pro-Palestine element within the White House. But because of money, of course, but also because of voters in swing states, very particular swing states, if you're perceived as very anti-Israel, let's say, or very pro-Palestine, then you might lose. So Kamala is being strategic and Trump is being strategic as well.
How do you respond to what you heard from both of the candidates, Ashley?
I do agree that they are both being strategic, but in different ways. I do believe Harris's position that she wants to show support for both Israel and Palestinians, though I do not believe that she is doing nearly enough for Palestinians. I very much support not only a ceasefire, but an arms embargo and the reduction of federal funds that we send to Israel, which I'm sure, JP, you would support as well as somebody who's America first, that we should keep that taxpayer money in our taxpayers' pockets rather than send it overseas. And I think what Trump is doing by designating Harris as this anti-Israel person is just kind of riling up his voter base with misinformation. As it stands, essentially any U.S. politician is currently pro-Israel. A vast majority of our politicians are funded by AIPAC, the American-Israeli Super PAC. So all of our politicians have a vested interest in protecting the state of Israel, whether it's what I support or not. The difference, though, in what I believe is that Harris actually has the intent to either stop or control the spread of violence in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, whereas I think Trump is emboldening it and is going to make the conflict a larger issue for the entire region.
Jacob, do you agree?
I think both of them are being strategic. I think Trump, being a populist, says things to rile up his supporters. Israel is not going to disappear if Tim Walz and Kamala win the election, or if Kamala wins the election. As for what she said, I think she does support Israel's right to exist. I think she will be a little bit more on the progressive side of trying to maybe put arms embargoes on Israel or something like that. But I don't think that a ceasefire is going to stop the violence. I think a ceasefire at this point in the war is ultimately useless. You have what occurred on the 7th of October, and then everything that ensued from that. Every proposal for a ceasefire has been not really compromisable, either from both sides with Netanyahu or Hamas. And then every ceasefire that, again, with Netanyahu rejecting them in Israel, but also Hamas demanding that they remain in power. So I don't think the violence ends with a ceasefire where Israel unilaterally withdraws all of its troops from Gaza. I think you have Iran also disrupting and destabilizing with their other proxy groups and other parts of the region.
I want to turn to you, Saad, and ask you, beyond just what you think about what the candidates said, what do you feel about where the two major parties stand on Israel and Palestine, and how is that impacting how you'll vote this year?
When you talk about where the two parties stand, there is where you would think they would stand ideologically, and then where they stand in practice. Ideologically, you would expect Republicans, at least libertarians, right, or isolationists, to say, we need to have an honest question about where this money is going and why we are funding this this war. They categorize it as a war in Israel. Netanyahu has not been able to fulfill his military objectives. When you look at the Democrats, you would think that they would be more progressive in the sense that unjustifiably killing innocent civilians is wrong. And at the end of the day, that is what Israel is doing. What both parties need to do is, at the very least, if they're not going to have the cojones to do an arms embargo, at least put conditions on the arms.
Who are you voting for?
I am going to vote for any candidate that is going to not only minimize the suffering of my people in Gaza, my people in the West Bank, my people in all of Palestine, in occupied Palestine, and our brothers and sisters in Lebanon. I am going to vote for whoever is going to give I vote based on policy. Whoever gives the policy that they're going to do an arms embargo on Israel, or they're going to stipulate conditions to weapons that are being given to the radical Netanyahu, then that person can have my vote. Otherwise, none of you people are getting my vote.
I want you to chime in here, Ashley,
Yes.
because you live in Dearborn, Michigan. Mm-hmm. It has the largest Arab American community in the United States. Michigan is also a battleground state in the United States. Your vote really, really matters. Michigan is also where the uncommitted movement started, and that was a way to pressure the Biden administration into a ceasefire and an arms embargo with Israel. Obviously, neither of them have come to fruition yet. You're a content creator, and I want to play one of the posts that you recently made on your TikTok, I believe.
Oh, no.
Let's listen to that.
Between Harris and Trump, we have two candidates who have a bad plan for foreign policy and for Gaza. With Jill Stein, we have a candidate who has no plan, just lip service that she can't actually accomplish. Turn your attention to Congress, the legislative body that is responsible for putting these policies in action.
So you are pro-Palestinian,
Yes.
You are half Lebanese, and you're voting for Harris. What has she done to earn your vote?
So I wouldn't say it's necessarily so much what Harris has done to earn my vote and more about what Trump has done to not earn my vote, what Stein has done to not earn my vote, and how I think Harris would impact Congress and congressional legislation. In my opinion, there are a lot of things that Trump has done in his first term that do not bode well specifically for Lebanon. And the point I want to make to that is his previous policies regarding the expansion of occupation. So Trump was actually the first foreign leader in history to recognize the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. He was the first U.S. president to recognize the move of the Israeli capital to Jerusalem. And I think that sets a very dangerous precedent for my people in Lebanon. While the south of Lebanon is currently being invaded, we have fears about the occupation spreading and the south of Lebanon being reoccupied by Israel. And that's something that I think a Trump presidency would heavily support. So it's in my best interest to avoid that as much as possible.
Ashley fears that the war will get worse under Trump, but the reality is that this war and the invasion of Lebanon is happening under the Biden administration. So for those of you who are supporting Trump, what is your argument for what his policies might be and how this war may or may not escalate or de-escalate? JP?
Yeah, well, first of all, when we talk about Trump, we talk about cabinet, the people behind him. But I think that in all of his, public talk, at the core, he remains the same America First guy that ran the first time. Of course, there's significant influence from people that are really interested in Israel, and he's appealing to those electorally. Just as he's moderating on abortion, just as he has changed his message many times before during an election season. But at the end of it all, I want to point out that both of you guys had said "my people" when talking about the people in Lebanon and the people in Palestine, in Gaza. And when I think about my people, I think about the American people. I have family in Venezuela. I actually lived in Venezuela. I think the American people should make the decision that's in the best interest of the American people, not in the best interest of Israel or Palestine. What I'm opposed to, again, is getting too concentrated in the Middle East when we have threats in our own hemisphere and in the Indo-Pacific. That's my problem. That's why I mean when I say America First. America First doesn't mean Israel sucks or Palestine sucks. It means Israel, be careful what you're doing. You're our better partner here. The rest of the West supports you. But be careful. We don't want you to cause too much trouble.
Right. So America First, January 6th, Donald Trump ripping up the Constitution to shreds, saying that he would do it again. America First. America First. Donald Trump having to backpedal on Project 2025, which he says he has nothing to do with. But Mehdi Hassan, excellent reporting on how every single person that wrote that document was on his that was his ex-cabinet members.
Yeah.
Ex-cabinet members.
America First,
you know why?
We didn't have Ukraine. We didn't have
One second. Ex-cabinet members. You know why? Ex-cabinet members, because he, like Mike Pence, like all the other people that were on his cabinet that he got to choose because it was his cabinet, said that he was atrocious to work with and that he is detrimental to the American people. So yes, you're right. Maybe I have my biases as a Palestinian American because, I have family back home that are stripped naked by literally our tax dollars, that are put in jail by our tax dollars. And you know what? I'm sorry for having that bias and for expressing that to the American people. But I just don't buy this narrative where we want to sit here and say that Kamala Harris or Donald Trump are America First candidates when both candidates are taking money from foreign entities, when both candidates don't have genuine policy. I don't feel like when Palestinian Americans say that arms being sent to Israel, that should be held accountable. That's not us being selfish. That's us as taxpayers. That's us as taxpayers saying that we don't want that money to go there, and it's actually fiscally responsible. I
personally sympathize with you when you say this about your personal situation. But again, you shouldn't be that surprised when the rest of the American people go womp womp. Why? Because I'm saying, I grew up in Venezuela. Sometimes I'm like, damn, I wish the American government did something about the situation in Venezuela. My grandma's there, my grandpa's there. But is that strategically in the interest of the United States? What do you expect? Do you expect the United States just to stop giving money to Israel at all and just support Palestine and then go and be friends with Iran again when Iran is present in our hemisphere like never before?
You made an amazing point. I don't realistically think that America is going to do those things. But what I think that America should do, if it actually believes in the values that it professes so much, is that at the very least, Lindsey Graham shouldn't go on live TV and say, what about the people of Israel when people are suffering from Hurricane Helene?
Okay.
I agree. Not my favorite senator, I would say.
Jacob probably feels personally attacked here, maybe, or no?
I agree with that too. I think a lot of the posts and stuff like that on social media, I think, are obviously influenced by money. I think AIPAC does have too much money in terms of lobbying, involvement in the United States government.
In both parties.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I would advocate for, not the removal of that, because lobbying is legal. They have the constitutional right to do that. There are many lobbying groups that...
Even as foreign entities?
Yes, because it's American. AIPAC is American. It's not for...
Because it's not registered as a foreign entity. Can you name...
So it isn't a foreign entity, though, is the whole point.
Can you name any other super PAC that represents Ukraine, that represents Iraq, that represents Canada, that represents the United Kingdom? Why only Israel?
I was just saying that I agree that the lobbying influences... I think a lot of U.S. politicians don't actually, in their minds and hearts, believe what they put out. I think that AIPAC does have a big influence in it, and I wouldn't have a problem at all with stripping that. I think they need to be more transparent and individualistic in their actual thoughts and ideas instead of bowing to a lobbyist group or organization. I would agree with that.
Okay. All right. I want to move on, and I want to talk about the U.S.'s global standing. The U.S. has long been seen as the world's superpower. I think we can all agree on that. But is it actually the world's policeman? And should it be?
I think the U.S. likes to position itself as the world's police and the world's superpower, but I think we are slowly losing that credibility, especially in places like the UN, where there are these massive votes going on regarding Israel and Palestine that the U.S. has repeatedly vetoed and voted against as the sole veto power in that position. And I think it is becoming increasingly transparent to even our Western allies and counterparts that we are not operating in the best interest of the world. We are operating in our own and Israel's self-interest.
Who agrees with Ashley here?
I think that the U.S. still sees itself as, the city on the hill. But what has changed is the mechanics of it all. And I think we're seeing the return of soft power as the main mechanism, because the unipolar moment, which, by the way, for the normal people who don't study security, the United States used to think of itself as the hegemon, as the sole power in international relations. With the rise of China, this has changed. And now I think that will likely mean that the U.S. will change some of its a tendency to overextend itself. So it's going to be, not because they want to, but because the U.S. has to prioritize certain regions. And maybe that's what's going to cause the U.S. to say, Israel, do this by yourself. We don't want to be involved. We're focusing here and here.
Right. Okay. So which other countries do you guys see rising in influence at the moment, and which do you see as a threat and versus maybe inspiring? Jacob?
Russia. I've already touched on Iran. I don't want to continue that. I think Russia. I think Putin has made it clear in a lot of his speeches that he wishes to disband or disconnect or take back anything that once had, the Soviet influence. He hasn't outright or directly said that he has some type of interest in invading NATO countries, but I think that if the United States were to ignore what he's doing in Ukraine, that it enables actions like that to continue. And if a potential aggression is placed on a NATO country, then Article 5 is invoked, and an attack on one is an attack on all. I think the United States needs to stand firm, not because we are supporters of the Ukrainian government or of its people, because Ukraine does have its problems, but as we are against the imperialist dictators like Vladimir Putin, because his actions ultimately, if continued, will have much more severe consequences.
How about you, Ashley?
I do agree that Russia does have a pretty strong influence, and I know he didn't want to mention Iran, but Iran does as well. These are two nations that have, at this point, it's known that Russia has nuclear powers. It's speculated that Iran does as well. And the situations that both are in with their current conflicts, we could see a pretty stark shift in power dynamics because of those nuclear powers, whether or not Iran decides to use them or is even being honest about their capabilities. But diplomatically, we have other nations that are really stepping up to the plate to combat the issue that's going on in Gaza, with South Africa levying charges against Israel and against Netanyahu in the ICJ. There are a number of different countries that are taking a stand that the U.S. just is not at this point.
Yeah. Jacob, I want to go back to you because you describe yourself as a moderate and you're undecided about who you're going to vote for president. In your view, should the U.S. engage in conflicts like those in Gaza or Ukraine?
I think going against Putin in Ukraine is very important. You also have Ukraine many years ago through, I forget what the agreement was called at the moment, but they gave up their nuclear weapons in return for support from, I believe, America as well as the United Kingdom. So not sticking by an alliance or an agreement like that, again, shows weakness in the face of people who in the West we deem to be bad, oppressive, or dictators like Putin, and enables him to continue those actions without some type of response.
So why are you still undecided?
As far as Donald Trump and Kamala, again, I think I agree with her on what she said in terms of it doesn't really matter who you vote for as a president. They can do some things through executive action and orders, but it matters who's in the Senate, who you have in Congress, who you have in the Senate, who you have in the House of Representatives. And I think that Donald Trump has done terrible things as a politician and as a person. I think he's a morally corrupt person. And I have issues with his handling of the former election and him trying to suspend the vote, him trying to find evidence of mass voter fraud when it wasn't there, him calling on people like Rudy Giuliani and the DOJ to investigate these things. And they've had audits and they've had investigations in every key swing state, and there's been no evidence of widespread voter fraud that would have changed the results of the election, yet he's continued to peddle this message that it was stolen from him. And I think the Republican Party has turned into Donald Trump's party and not the Republican Party.
I want to move on to talk about the protests across U.S. universities that we saw sweep the country this year. Protests on college campuses this year have drawn comparisons to the anti-Vietnam War movement. How important do you think these protests and movements are in pushing for change? And how do you feel about the state of free speech on campuses today?
I think there's a lot of people in America who really underestimate movements like this that occur on college campuses. I mean, you mentioned the Vietnam War, but then also apartheid South Africa. Protests erupted all over college campuses and universities, and they had such an instrumental change to the way that Americans view these systems. I think they are incredibly important. And I think a lot of young voters are really, really passionate about these sort of things. And we should be able to hear their voices and their opinions on these incredibly important issues, especially since young voters are the people who are going to inherit this system. We're seeing a massive shift in generations where this is Gen Z and millennials' future. We should have a very significant say in this.
Yeah, Saad, do you agree? And do you think everyone has the right to protest?
So 1,000%. I totally agree, but I also want to preface this, like it wasn't like a bunch of people brought tents to Columbia University, which everyone thinks that this is where it all started. It started with professors being censored, students being censored, clubs being censored. And for example, with the case in Hunter College, I don't know if you guys reported on this, but Hunter College actually tried to do a showing of Israelism, which was a film that was created by ex-IDF soldiers. They kept postponing the filming at Hunter College until they eventually just stopped it completely on the grounds that it was anti-Semitic. And when you keep poking the bear over and over again, obviously students are going to get riled up. And like it's unfortunate to say, for people that support Israel, but they have a moral compass. So that's why, especially in New York City, there was this huge outburst of people just coming out in support of Palestinians. And now to the question of does everybody have the right to protest? It is my personal belief, and me as someone that has been part of the student movement that has had to put people in check. We as Palestinians do not accept anybody that wants to use our banner to spread anti-Semitic vitriol and hate and threaten the lives of other people.
JP, Jacob, do you have any thoughts? Or are you at all concerned about the state of free speech on campuses today?
No, I would mainly agree with him. I think everyone has the right to protest. I would agree that The protesting has mainly touched the younger generation, being on college universities, and those people that's the next generation that's being raised up. And those people will eventually be our representatives, our politicians and stuff like that. But I've had friends that have physically gone to the protests. I do think, generally speaking, that the movement has been co-opted, or a lot of the protests. I haven't been there to physically say that the majority of people there are spewing violent rhetoric or stuff like that, but I have friends who have been. I've seen video footage of people who have been. I have had friends that have had weapons pulled on them, who have had hot spaghetti sauce and water thrown on them for doing nothing other than holding signs up.
What kind of signs?
Signs saying "come and debate," because I have friends who have platforms that host debates. I've had friends who have gone there, recorded themselves trying to talk to other people. And a thing that I think is sad is that a lot of the people who are at these protests don't know much about the conflict, which isn't their fault. I think younger people tend to have a desire to affiliate themselves with a group. If you study public opinion, you'll see this. People have desires to affiliate themselves with groups to gain personal value and to feel special. But if you go ask 5 out of 10 at least of these students, from what river to what sea are you trying to free Palestine from? They don't know. They don't know what the chant means. I think it does more harm than good to the movement, and I think it has been co-opted.
Ashley, do you think he might be discrediting the level of knowledge some of these activists have?
I think so, but I do also want to point out that when we talk about there being people co-opting the movement, there are, to a certain level, people who show up to these movements, to these protesters, who are agitators, who are there intentionally to sow discord. And I've seen it myself at protests in Dearborn, that people come in with the specific intent of assigning this negative rhetoric to our movement, to kind of paint us in this light as being anti-Semitic. And then we get to this point where it does bleed into policy. We've seen bills proposed that criticisms of Israel as a whole would be considered anti-Semitic. So the lines get really blurred of what's appropriate and what's not. And then on college campuses specifically, it becomes a huge free speech issue.
If I can just make a point really quickly. I totally agree with what you're saying, Ashley, and I honestly think that this is a cancer that is spreading throughout America. I don't necessarily think that these colleges are necessarily Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, but I do think that the administrations, as shown in that in the Congress hearing with Columbia and multiple institutions a few months back, when they were asked very basic questions about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that they weren't able to answer, it just goes to show how negligent the heads of these academic institutions are. And now, some academic institutions are making the decision to just separate both groups of people completely, like CUNY, because they think that we're children and that we can't sit down like adults and talk about stuff like we're doing right now. And in other cases, they're just doing whatever is convenient for them to get the federal funding and the grants that they want to get for their students. And that is not how academic institutions should be run, because we could have been in a society right now where my Jewish brothers and sisters, my identifying Israeli brothers and sisters could have sat down in a room with college, with people that work in the staff with college, and just talked about the issues that were going on.
Okay, I want to move on from there. I want to go back to the topic of the military. So the Department of Defense has had a really hard time convincing young people to enlist in the military. They recently reported being 41,000 recruits short of their goal. Why do you think that is? What is driving this change of attitude toward military enlistment and also involvement abroad?
We don't want to be fighting wars that we don't believe in anymore. Going all the way back to Vietnam, look at the way that vets were treated on their way back from Vietnam. They went overseas to fight a war they did not believe in, lost brothers in combat, lost limbs, and came home to be treated the way that they were because they were forced to fight for something they didn't believe in. And we as a generation, millennials, Gen Z, and everybody below us, I don't think we believe in that enough to want to sign up and fight these wars. And that doesn't have anything to do with us not liking America as a country, just on this broad idea.
Yes. Do you want to serve a country you don't love?
Maybe the country needs to start doing things that we support. We will love the country when it does the things that we support.
I think that's nonsense. You love your country because it's your country. You don't love your country because they do this and because they do that.
That's what the British told the Americans when they try to secede from as a colony.
Exactly. Thank you.
Well, you have
and they fought over tax on tea, not on human rights.
Yes, but we're talking about the country today. We love things first abstractly, and then we love them concretely.
That wasn't abstract. That was a real moment in history. The Boston Tea Party happened.
Yes. If you want to go back to the Boston Tea Party and talk about like...
I mean, it's integral to American politics.
We're not talking about like it's a different country today. It's our country. We know it's our country. But what I want to say though, is that you talk about like recruitment, and reality is much more complex. The recruitment issue is not about like the progressives who don't want to go into the military because like America is doing too much militarism or whatever. Actually, most of the military is made out of white dudes in the South, and many of them do not want to join the military for the opposite.
Why do you
so things are much more complex.
Isn't that also things that they do not believe in, though? That is also things they do not believe in. And I didn't minimize this argument at all to being about one race or one generation or one anything. This is a broad phenomenon that we're seeing across our country. It's not just, liberals don't want to fight for the country because they don't love America. There are white men, like you said, who also don't want to fight for the country for their own reasons. We all have political reasons we don't want. Bro, what do you...
That's literally what we see in the polls. Okay. Actually, the military is the most Republican of all branches.
Let me remain
well, it's not
respectful.
a branch, all groups in government.
Okay, Jacob, I appreciate you waiting patiently. Go ahead, what did you want to say?
I think there's a distinct difference between patriotism and nationalism. The way I would categorize it is that nationalism is a devotion or pledge or support for a nation simply due to the fact that it is that nation, where patriotism is the same pledge, devotion, and support, but for explained reasons, not because America is America, but because America gives me this, and this, or I enjoy these protections, these rights, these freedoms in America. So I think the government or the country itself has to have something to offer that is worthy of support and allegiance.
Bringing it back to international relations and some of the things we were discussing earlier, I want to ask you guys if you feel most threatened by a foreign country when we're talking about threats to the U.S., or do you feel more at risk from factors that are closer to home, for example, gun violence or climate change? Let's start with JP.
Number one, the Indo-Pacific most likely, and the potential of conflict there. And number two, the Western Hemisphere. Actually, I would sometimes say the Western Hemisphere number one. I think that mass migration is very concretely affecting the American people. I think that the developments in our hemisphere affect us more directly, and the fact that we've looked over our hemisphere is a big mistake.
Are you talking about immigration?
I'm talking about our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, Latin America. Immigration is a part of it, but there's many other things.
Okay. Ashley, same question to you. Is it in terms of personal threat to your livelihood, your future, your safety, is it more of a foreign threat or is it factors here at home domestically?
I think it's more of a domestic threat, and I think specifically being a visibly Muslim woman in the kind of climate that we have currently in the country that we've created, there are a lot of threats for women who look like me or men from my community. We have a significant, stark rise in Islamophobia in the last 12 months because of the conversation about Israel and Palestine. We have seen a significant number of attacks to specifically visibly Muslim women. And I think at this point in time, that is the greatest threat to people in my community and to myself.
Yeah, and I just want to point out for our listeners, you do wear the hijab. So when you say visibly Muslim woman, you're referring to your hijab. Jacob, what do you think?
In terms of who's the biggest threat, I don't know. I would agree that the mass influx of immigrants, not just from certain areas to America, but to the Western world, has shaped and molded the Western values. I think there's a lot of people who are coming to America, not necessarily with bad intentions, but who have bad perceptions of America and who aren't necessarily going to be very productive. But I do think that immigration spurs the economy. I think it works. It's not detrimental. We shouldn't close off our borders to anybody. But I don't know. I think there's threats everywhere in the West, in the Indo-Pacific. I don't really see China as doing anything with Taiwan. I think Russia is the biggest threat, honestly, but I don't even see them as a big threat. I think the potential of these external threats is much larger than anything from within the United States, but pragmatically, the realistic threat that we see on a daily basis that we're going to keep seeing is Americans on Americans.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me hearing you guys answer these questions, bearing in mind you're the generation that grew up with active shooter drills in schools, which is remarkable. But Saad, I want you to weigh in really briefly on this.
Okay, so you can categorize it with domestic and foreign. What I would say domestically is yes, I do think immigration is a big issue, and I think that it's something that can be solved if you had someone that genuinely wanted to solve it. Donald Trump did not genuinely want to solve it. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden did not genuinely want to solve it.
What do you think is the main thing that U.S. politicians don't understand is most important to your generation? Let's start with Jacob.
Economic opportunity. People's happiness derives from money. That's how the world works. People are inherently greedy. Making things more economically viable and boosting the economy to make the cost of living easier is directly going to result in a better nation.
Okay, Ashley.
I agree. Economic opportunities, I think, are severely lacking for people in our generation. There's a huge disparity between Gen Z and Gen X, and I think that's something that we are not really giving enough attention to, specifically as it pertains to things like student loans, medical debts, the housing issues. There are a lot of different economic policies that I think we need that are just not really being addressed.
Okay, JP.
Yeah, connected to what we were talking about before about the patriotism. The reason many of us are not patriotic is because we don't see a future, a functional future. Owning a home, forming a family, having kids. For many of my peers, it sounds like an impossibility. And I think if our government starts moving in that direction, which they assume we just like hate those things or something, but it's really because we don't see ourselves doing it. It's kind of like a psychological operation we do on ourselves. Yeah. We don't want a family, but it's really, we don't see ourselves being able to make a family.
Fair. Saad?
Ashley, Jacob brought up the economy. I definitely agree. I feel like I can't live on my own. I still live with my parents at 24, and that's not where they were when they were my age, and I don't think that they were respectfully as well off as me. But what I will also say is the militarized police state. I think it is in places like San Diego, in places like LA, in places like Chicago, in places like Dearborn, in places like New York City, in places like DC. I believe that it is a gross misuse of tax dollars that is literally coming at the cost of literally the blood and bruises of students on American campuses.
Okay. Next question. If you could offer a vision of how you want to see the U.S. operate on the world stage, what would it be? Ashley.
I would like the U.S. to pull back from its self-appointed title of being the world's police and be a little bit more diplomatic, especially in places like the UN, and rather than using veto power to instead insist that the U.S. gets what it wants or is the sole mediator in other conflicts, I would like them to relinquish some of that power to the world stage.
Okay. Jacob?
I would partially agree. I think non-interventionist or more isolationist is how I would prefer the United States to function, but again, being pragmatic and understanding every nation and its people have its desires, and people are greedy, nations are greedy and are going to act in their own best self-interest. There's nothing that I can really do other than observe it and criticize some things and agree with some things. So that's where I stand on it.
How do you want to see the U.S. operate on the world stage, JP?
Yeah, we could dive into every particular issue, but I would say in general, foreign policy stoicism, I call this, focusing on the most concrete threats, being strategically humble as a power in global affairs. The United States, most of the time, the problem they make is that they overestimate threats or underestimate their capacity, and we shouldn't do that. And I think that starts with being a more humble power. Humble doesn't mean self-degrading. America first doesn't mean isolationism. America first doesn't mean America alone, but it does mean being aware of what we actually can do, being aware of sway. One of the issues I have with the Middle East is that I'm preoccupied with how much sway the U.S. has. We should focus on regions where we have more sway or where there are actually concrete threats to our homeland, to our people.
Let's hear from Saad.
What I will say is, to tie this all back together, is I think money in politics is a really, really, really big issue. And I think if we can get AIPAC to register as a foreign entity and to get the NRA and the, honestly, I don't know how we're gonna get it done, but just Governments have the responsibility, corporations have the responsibility to make money. Governments have the responsibility to help people. Corporations have too much power over our government, and our government is just not able to govern. So we just need to get rid of that system.
What do you want the global audience to know about the values of your generation? I'm going to start with Jacob.
Again, I can't speak for everyone. The values of my generation, I think I would agree with JP on a lot of things. I think a lot of my generation are anti-America for reasons they shouldn't be. I think if people take more pragmatic approaches into understanding how the world operates, why certain countries and leaders do what they do, then we could have more rational conversations.
Ashley.
To the global audience, I would say that we are not our politicians. As Americans, we do not believe every single thing that our politicians do. And I think that we, especially in the pro-Palestinian camp, we hold a lot of space for Palestinians. And I would hope that the global audience holds some of that regard for us as well and understands that to some degree we are voting under duress.
Okay. JP, very brief.
Yeah, I think that if I could say anything to the world is that American youth is not that weird as you guys might think. Like a lot of my friends in other parts of the world think that like Americans are all really weird. We're not as hyper-political as you think. Actually, Generation C is not as super liberal as some people imagine. So a lot of conservatives, a lot of liberals, a lot of moderates. So don't think we're crazy. We're actually kind of cool.
All right, last word, Saad.
Like Ashley said, we are voting under duress. And to the people of Congo, to the people of Palestine, to the people of Ukraine, to the people of Sudan, to the people of Haiti, we're failing you. And we're so sorry that we cannot do a better job, and we are going to try, and we are trying so hard.
Great note to end on. Thank you. Thank you guys so much.